You'll find treasures more valuable than gold, digging in the Word.
Hi, this is Link Hudson, and welcome to Digging in the Word. Thank you for joining me for the episode about why some pastors fear prophecy. I have to apologize for the rest of the video. I recorded it with some free new software I downloaded, and it turned out there's a glitch with it, and it cut off the left-hand side of the screen, even though it looked like it was recording the entire screen. So if you'd like to pop up a window to watch the remainder of this video, feel free to do so, or you can watch the video and see the top of my head and read parts of the verses are on the screen. You'll miss the left-hand edge of the verse. I hope you enjoy the video teaching series. Thank you. And let's focus on these verses. Let the prophet speak 2 or 3. My Greek professor acquaintance, whose mailing list I'm on, would be inclined to think that 2 or 3 refers to what the prophets speak, as opposed to what the number of prophets, and he would use that based on analogy up to his argument on verse 26, because in verse 26 and 27 here you've got tongues being spoken, 2 or at the most 3, and then you have a restriction on the speaking of tongues that it must be done only if there's an interpreter. And down here with prophets you have prophets speaking 2 or 3, and then you have a restriction on the speaking of the prophet, let the other judge, and here that the prophet must be quiet to yield the floor to the next person speaking. Actually, in churches that believe in prophecy, I don't know, maybe I've seen this a couple of times. I don't think most churches that practice prophesying or that allow it have really dug enough into this passage to really practice this, or to make an attempt to practice it. Or maybe they only have one person prophesying and other people don't get moved to speak. But the normative that we see here for the church, that we see here in this passage, is one person is prophesying and another person gets a revelation, and the person who's prophesying, or the prophet who's speaking, shuts up and lets the person who gets the revelation, the other person sitting by, prophesy. Now, what you might say, another sitting by is another prophet. Personally, I believe that it's any other member of the congregation, based on verse 31. For ye may all prophesy. Ye in the passage refers to the Corinthians, and Paul is speaking of the prophets in the third person. So he says prophets. He doesn't call them ye. He calls the church ye, or you. So that's why I would say that if anyone sitting by, another sitting by would be another individual who receives a prophecy. They don't have to be recognized as a prophet or gifted in the ministry of prophet to give a revelation, and for the prophet who is speaking to be quiet. Because this little thing right here of the rule that tells the prophet who's speaking to be quiet, if another person receives a revelation, is what connects it to the next verse. For ye may all prophesy one by one. So since everyone can prophesy one by one, the speaking prophet should be quiet if another person receives a revelation. This is something that churches need to be open to and to realize. And I know some people, I grew up, I went to an Assemblies of God growing up, and I heard the teaching that there's a maximum of 2 or 3 prophecies per meeting. And this passage says no such thing. There's no restriction to 2 or 3 prophecies in a meeting in this passage. It says to let the prophet speak 2 or 3 and let the other judge. It doesn't say then shut up. It says after that you're supposed to let the other judge. And the number of prophecies in a meeting, for ye may all prophesy one by one. If there's more than 3 people in the meeting, and everybody is allowed at least to prophesy, then there can be more than 3 prophecies in a meeting. If there's 10 people and every one of those people is allowed to prophesy, or if there's 10 prophets, if that's how you take it, then there can be more than 3 prophecies in a church meeting. So we need to really carefully dissect what the passage is saying, and not just repeat a tradition that we've heard without really studying it carefully. The spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. I take spirits here in the sense of the pneumatica type gift, perhaps an equivalent. I bounced this idea off of my Greek professor friend, and he seemed to agree that perhaps the pagans used the word spirits to mean the same thing a Christian would mean for spiritual gift, except coming from another source. So the gifts of the prophets, their ability to prophesy, is subject to the prophets. So the Indonesian translation, if you translate it back to English, says the gifts of the prophets are subject to the prophets. So at least the scholars who translated that took it that way. Because God is not the author of confusion, but the but a peace as in all the churches of the saints. Now, if we let this sink in and let it change our concept of what church is all about, or actually what we're supposed to do in church. So when it comes to the ministry of the Word, a lot of pastors have this traditional thought that I'm supposed to minister the Word and everybody else is supposed to be quiet. And if they're charismatic or Pentecostal, they may allow for a prophecy or two during the lull, during the song service. But hey, it's my turn to speak. The speaking part is mine. That's the way a lot of pastors think, or guest speakers, or whatever. They think that way. And I know it can be frustrating if you're up there teaching the Bible and people get prophetic words and you think, well, I planned all this teaching. When am I going to get to teach? But if the Spirit really is moving people in the congregation to speak, whether it's whatever kind of prophecy it is, it could be about a doctrinal issue right out of the Bible, whatever the Lord is moving people to speak, then we should let the Holy Spirit move. And I know in the early days of the Pentecostal movement, for example, one of the movements that believes in the gift of prophecy, there was a concept that they wanted meetings that were led by the Holy Spirit, where the Spirit led people to do different things. And I believe we've gotten away from that, and we've developed our own liturgy and movements that believe in these gifts. And we restrict even the gift of prophecy far beyond the restriction that Paul had. I mean, look in the passage we just looked at. Paul thought it was good if all prophesy. He says you may all prophesy one by one. So we need to change our concept of what church is supposed to be like and what the ministry of the Word is supposed to be like to conform to what the Word teaches about the ministry of the Word, and to allow for these gifts to function in the church. The church meeting is not just a place to go listen to one person talk. So many churches are built on the pastor. I don't go to that church because they got a new pastor and he wasn't funny, or they usually don't say that, or he didn't teach the Bible well enough. He just told stories, or that you don't like the pastor's personality, or he hurt your feelings. But if you look in the Bible, they had a plurality of elders. The church was not about that one guy talking up in the front. They didn't have just one guy talking in the front. Each person used their gifts to edify other people. Look how Paul and Barnabas planted churches. They left them with no official leaders, and somehow they were a church, and they had church. They did church. They were the church during that time when there was no official leader. They had to be doing something. They were ministering to one another with their gifts, I believe, because we see from what Paul taught the Corinthians and from how the Spirit was working in the churches at that time, that there were in the churches there were people with gifts, whether it was teaching or prophecy or whatever gifts they had, and they would minister one to another. Now that reminds me, when we're talking about our philosophy of what church is about, let's look at another passage that's often used to tell people to go to church. In fact, it's the only verse I know of that really gets used to really hammer that thought in. Let's look at it. So that's point one, why some pastors why some pastors are afraid of the gift of prophecy. They have a wrong understanding about the role of the gift of prophecy in the church, and that it is supposed to have a prominent role, and that the church meeting is not just about the pastor talking. That can seriously inhibit a pastor's acceptance of the gift of prophecy if he thinks it's just a little add-on or something that's not so important. And I'll get into some deeper reasons that relate to fear in later sessions of this teaching. God bless you. Thank you for joining me